Thanks, Vir, for agreeing to do this in person. After the second wave, this is our first in-person event at BIC. And thank you for being here. You know, it's doubly gratifying as somebody who has to manage BIC finances that the speaker bears their own fare and stay costs. So thank you so much for that, Vir. For those of you who have turned up here, obviously Vir needs no introduction. But I did speak to a few people who have already read his book. And the general feedback that I got that it is an easy and racy read, something like a Mills and Boon's book, maybe. But so, Vir, you have avid readers and they like your style. So that's to our local boy Rahul, who chose to be a lawyer and a privacy guru over cricket. Thank you for being our interlocutor today. You know, at the end of the year, Rahul puts out 52 tweets, one book for each week of the year. Vir and I will be watching whether this book makes that 52 tweet list. So Rahul, you're forewarned. Lastly, you know, Rahul has tweeted that he's anxious about doing this session because being an interlocutor is a new experience. We are curious to see whether it's going to be hard talk or soft lobs. Over to you, Rahul.
Thanks, Ravi. It's just like incredible amount of pressure. One live event and 4 television things before. Yeah. So you should be good at this. But I'm always on the other side, which is why this time it's like, you know, spotlight is in the other direction. The spotlight should be on you now. Okay. Mills and Boone, right? So you know, when I and thanks, Ravi. Ravi asked me to do this in a heartbeat. I said yes, I want to do it. I want to see what it's like to be on the other side, really. And of course, I said I need a copy of the book, and I read. You know, I ordered it on Amazon. As usual, it took its own time to come, and you very kindly sent me a digital version so that I could read it. And Ravi is right. Within a day, I think I was at page 250. I have to say, my wife read the entire book in a day. So it's a racy read,
and has strong views about it.
She has strong views. She has strong views on it. But it's, you know, I've heard so many people talk about it and say it's a history of India, but it's not so much a history of India. It's sort of a story of your life. And it just so happens that you are the Forrest Gump of India because you keep showing up at all these, you know, meeting all these people, these famous people, hanging out with prime ministers. And that's what I think is what fascinated me about the book, because I was more thinking about, you know, where is he going to pop up next?
Yeah, my wife said Zelig, you know, there's this Woody Allen movie about this non-entity who pops up everywhere. So there's an element of Zelig about the book.
But it's also fairly, you know, when you think, when you read the whole book, it's fairly deep towards the end. I don't want to give the end away, but you wrap it up quite well. And I think that's why I'd like to just sort of center the conversation around you know, your life and what you did throughout all of these various things. And we'll obviously speak about politicians and film stars and things like that. We also spoke yesterday, and it's actually very surprising that a lot of this book mirrors my life. I'm much younger than you. Let's be very clear about that. But we happen to be in Bombay at the same time.
4 or 5 years, right?
No, come on. Either I'm being kind to you or you're being kind to me. But you know, Bombay at the same time, Calcutta at the same time. And your childhood was, shall we say, you were sort of born with a silver spoon. I think, you know, you say that your parents had sort of a rom-com of a life where they eloped, and you want to talk a little bit about that just to set that context, because it's a very interesting. I wouldn't think this.
Yeah, but I mean, however interesting you think my life is, it was nothing compared to my father's life. My father was born in 1921 to a low middle class family in Rajkot, what was then Kathiawad, is now part of Gujarat. And he became, at a very early age, 16 or 17, he was obviously quite precocious. He'd managed to read all of Das Kapital, which is more than I've ever done. And he'd become a dedicated communist. He then came to Ahmedabad, where my mother lived, and he became friends with her family. And because he was very bright and he was very charismatic, and very persuasive, he converted all of them to his brand of Marxism, which would have been okay, except that my mother belonged to a very rich mill-owning family. And they viewed my father with great suspicion for obvious reasons as this lower middle class joker who'd come along and wanted to take away all their money and was poisoning the entire family against the business community. And what was worse, I think, from their perspective, is that my mother fell in love with him. So they were then bitterly opposed to my father, wanted to have nothing to do with him, which was in a sense okay, because my father, in a decision that I find bizarre, but I think was probably true of his age, threw away his life and decided he would become a Communist Party of India worker, which meant that he was a card carrying member. They paid him a stipend, and all he did was communist activities, which was more dangerous than it sounds, because at that stage the CPI was banned. He went off to Bombay. He lived in a communist cell, did all this communist stuff while my grandparents told my mother, see, what a relief, you're rid of this man, etc. He was then arrested after independence because the CPI was illegal. And sorry, before that, he got married. He got married to a fellow Communist Party worker, was thrown into jail, was there for 9 months. And while he was there, in a sense, his life fell apart because his wife came to see him along with a comrade. And after they'd done the Lal Salam and all that nonsense, she said, we have something to tell you. And he said, what? And she said, I have to tell you that I am pregnant. And he was a little surprised because he'd been in jail for a long time. And the comrade who'd come along said, I am the father. So it became very clear to him that while the Communist Party did not believe in private property, this was taking things a bit too far. So obviously the marriage broke up and he came out of jail, and then the Communist Party went after him for some ideological deviation. There was a court set up, kangaroo court, by the party, and the commissar who pressed the charges against him was his own brother. Such was the nature of the Communist Party in those days and perhaps today. So he left the Communist Party, I think, with them giving him a good kick on the way out because they didn't want him anywhere. And he was then left with nothing in his life. So my mother now reappeared, having not got married, not having done anything, waiting for him, and said to him, let's get married. And he said, how? Your father will never allow this. And she said, no, I'll find a way. And my mother that's a very remarkable woman. She'd been sent abroad to study in the 1940s, which was unusual for women, particularly from Gujarati business families. And she went and got a job in Bombay. And she arranged and plotted. My father, who then started writing, went off to cover some UN conference in Paris. My mother arranged for a ticket on a ship, went off to Paris, joined him, and they got married in 1951 in Paris on the run, while her father said very abusive things and offensive things and threatened even, I think, to shoot my father. But once they got married, there was pretty much nothing they could do. And it happens with many Indian families with very bad grace. They accepted that my mother was now married and this communist was now part of the family. And they said, my parents told my grandfather to make him feel better. He's not really a communist any longer. He's not part of the party. It didn't make my grandfather feel much better. But while my mother was in London, she said to him, you have to do something with your life. So she worked, did a job in London and put him through the bar. So he came back to India with a barrister's degree, I think it's called, with a law degree at any rate, and was for the first time in a position to earn a living, he must have been 30 something, having wasted his life to this point on some communist dream and believing in Stalin and all of that. And that's how their life began. And because my father's occupation was a lawyer, he had a reasonable middle class standard of living, but my mother's family were rich. So there was no shortage of money. And then in the 60s, when my father decided to make something of himself, he went abroad. He made friends with various influential people, including the Shah of Iran. He set up a company in London which did political PR. He had offices in Mayfair. We had a flat in London. And that was like what you're referring to, the silver spoon in my mouth, the life of luxury and privilege, which was very good when it lasted. But my father died when I was 15. And suddenly all that money and all that life of luxury and everything dried up. And I went back to India and started all over again on my own. Brief summary.
Yeah, that was excellent. But there was one little nugget that you left out, which I found was quite interesting, which is that you the I don't think you can call him a midwife, but the person who gave birth to you was of some pedigree.
Yes, yes. Well, my grandfather now said, "You married this useless character. All you can do is at least give me a grandchild." And they tried. And we're now talking about 52, 53 when my mother was 32, 33, which now is normal, but in those days was considered slightly old. And she had one miscarriage. Then she went to Dr. Shirodkar, who was like one of the best doctors in India, and had a second miscarriage. And they went and told my grandfather that I don't think we will ever have children. It's biologically, physiologically not possible. And my grandfather, in the manner of all vulgar Indian businessmen, said, "Money is no object. Find someone." He said, "Look, we've gone to everyone. There's no one." So he said, "Go to London, find a doctor there." And they said, "We don't know any doctors in London." And he said, "I've heard the Queen has had a son called Charles." They said, "Yes." "Find the doctor who delivered Charles." And bizarrely, this Gujarati family couple went to London, went and met this doctor. And I don't know what he made of them, but he agreed to handle her pregnancy. And lo and behold, my grandfather was right. The pregnancy was successful, and here I am.
But your father's death was really quite a sudden shock because you were looking to, I think at some point you say that your father actually planned to have you join him and to work with him, and then suddenly all of that was not there. And later on in the book, you say that drastically changed your life.
Yeah, it did. I mean, when I look back, it was pretty traumatic then, but when I look back, it was pretty much the defining event in my life because my father was well off, but he was well off in the way that somebody who earned a living every month was. He didn't have factories and wealth and all of that. In 1971, in April 71, he fell ill. He was told it was jaundice, and he had these very fancy Harley Street doctors, and they said nothing to worry about. But there was something to worry about. He'd had a X-ray earlier in his lung. They'd found a shadow. He was a 2 cigarette packs a day man, and they'd done nothing. His doctors had done nothing. He'd done nothing. The cancer traveled from his lung to his liver, and in that era, liver cancer was a killer. And there was no proper MRIs where you could identify it. So they operated. They found that it was a tumor, and they sent him to cancer specialists who said, "Look, it's over. There's no way you're going to beat this." And of course, nobody wants that. So he went to New York, and they had very expensive doctors and expensive hospitals. But by July, he was dead. And as of April, I'd gone and seen him at the London clinic, and except for jaundice, which is fine, he seemed hale and hearty and healthy. And suddenly I saw him, and that's quite traumatic if you see this guy who's full of life waste away before your eyes in these very expensive hospitals, and knowing that no matter what the doctors tell you, no matter how much money they spend, he's not going to make it. He's just not going to survive. And then in July, he died. We came back to India, and whatever money he made a fair amount of money. It was spent on this incredibly expensive medical treatment in New York and in London. So we had no money left abroad. My father had made all these great plans that I would finish at Admire, where I was at school. I'd do 2 years at Eton and then go to Oxford and all of that. And suddenly all of that was up for grabs because there was just about enough money to educate me. But the house in London had to be given up. Those wonderful first-class trips had to be given up. Those fancy holidays and hotels were no longer possible. My mother, who hadn't worked then, would stop working for many years and had changed from being the very strong, self-assured woman who went to Paris and organized their wedding, became morose, depressed, couldn't live with the fact that there was no money now, fell to pieces, and it became very clear to me when I was 15 that I was pretty much on my own. So there was enough money to send me to school, but nobody to organize going to school. So I went to London. I stayed with relatives. I went through the public school handbook, found a school I liked, talked my way in, met the headmaster, and who was a kind man, decent man. He gave me a place at the school. And then he said, "Why have you come on your own? Don't you have a parent? Don't you have any adult who can do this for you?" And I told, frankly, no. So he said, "Who will pay your fees?" So I pulled out a checkbook and I wrote a check for the first term. And I think that more than anything else got me in because he was confident that I could look after myself. And because I went to school in England, I was ideally placed then to go to Oxford. And by this happy accident of birth involving the Queen's surgeon, because I was born in England and because I had relatives who lived in the UK, my education was free. Not in those days, the welfare state was in full swing. Not only did I not have to pay the university fee, they also gave me what is called a maintenance grant, which was money to stay and to survive and to pay my bills. So in a sense, because of my grandfather's slightly vulgar insistence that I went to the Queen, that my mother went to the Queen's doctor, he ended up paying for my education.
But you always knew that you were going to be a journalist because by the time you graduated from college, you already had, I think you said 25 bylines under your belt and you were doing this on the side. How did you get into journalism? Because that's what you've been doing ever since.
Ever since. That's the only thing I know how to do. I was at school with a boy whose mother worked for a company called Thomson Press. Thomson Press had a sister company called Thomson Living Media in those days, which started a magazine called India Today. It was a magazine started by people in Delhi who had no experience of the business. The staff in Delhi was under 25. They were desperate to find someone who would write things from Bombay. I had my gap year in those days in England, maybe still true. Between the time you took your exam for Oxford and the time you went up to university, you had 9 months off. So I was hanging around in India, not doing very much. And she said to me, this is my friend's mother, why don't you guys write for India Today? There was no money. They paid for a story, I think 150 rupees. And if you did a small item for what was called the eye catchers page, the people page, 25 rupees. But it was fun. I enjoyed it. We managed to do interesting stories. We managed to meet all the people who mattered in Bombay in those days. And I enjoyed the thrill of journalism, the sense that no 2 days were the same, that even though I was not even 20, I was 19, that even though I was a 19-year-old, I could go off and interview important people. And because I represented some kind of journalistic publication, though India Today was not a big deal in those days, they would treat me with respect. So I began to enjoy journalism. And then I went back to Oxford, as Rahul says, with 25 bylines, went to Oxford with 25 bylines to my name. And Oxford has 3 8-week terms, which means you're there for 6 months. 6 months of the year, you're on vacation. So I would come back to India and work as a journalist for those 6 months. And in 1978, when I was 22, India Today said they wanted to start a new magazine called Bombay. And I said, yeah, but I will be away. And they said, no, don't worry. You can work on it in your vacation. When you finish your university exam, come back to India and become the editor. So we prepared this magazine and I finished with Oxford and I came back to India. I think a fortnight later, the first issue of Bombay magazine came out. Now, it could have been a disastrous decision. There wasn't much money in journalism in those days. There was no evidence that Bombay would succeed. Not even much evidence I was any good at it. But when you look back, I think it was just fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. So did I always want to become a journalist? I guess I drifted into it. If I had finished at Oxford and I had wanted to do something, would I have chosen journalism? Honestly, I don't know.
So let's now talk about that because that's, as you said, literally all we have left to talk about. That's all you've done for the rest of your life. And I'd like to split it into, Bombay, Calcutta, and perhaps the rest, and not, by your magazines or the newspapers or, the TV stuff. But the Bombay that you described is really the Bombay that I remember in many ways from my childhood. As I said, I was much younger, and that was that there was a triumvirate in Bombay. That was the film stars, the politicians, and the underworld. And remarkably, you've managed to interact with all of them. And I wanted to spend a little time talking about those because at least I find them really interesting. I'm going to start with what I really like and what I found really interesting, which is when the Beatles came, or rather when George Harrison came, you managed to interview him. When Miles Copeland came looking to do a gig in India for the police, you managed to help him out. I just love rock. I've been following these guys for a long time, and just to know that you actually had a long conversation with George Harrison when he dissed Paul McCartney. That's the kind of stuff I really enjoyed in the book.
Yeah, thank you. But I mean, the George Harrison thing was purely accidental. because we used to do these small people page things. We used to troll hotel lobbies looking for interesting celebrities who'd come to India. And somebody let slip that a very big rock star was coming, wouldn't tell us the name. And we then bluffed our way, me and my friend Niku, whose mother had got me to write for India Today, and managed to find out that it was George Harrison. And then we were hugely excited, which is what, 76, the Beatles were broken up 4 or 5 years ago. No member of the Beatles has spoken publicly about the split, except for John Lennon, who's given a very jaundiced and hysterical view with Yoko Ono by his side. So we thought that if he could get George Harrison to talk about the breakup of the Beatles, we would have this international scoop. Now, we were kids, so we were kidding ourselves. George Harrison was in India for a wedding in Ravi Shankar's family. He was checked in under a false name. He believed that nobody knew he was here. So the most irritating thing for him was this kid who would call him up every day and say, "Sir, can I have an interview?" And of course, he was just rude and obnoxious and said, "Get lost and I haven't come here to do interviews." And then I did some creative thinking. He had an album out called 33 and a Third, which I assume nobody remembers because it was a really forgettable album. But I wrote him a little note saying I'd heard the album in London and how wonderful it was. And I slipped it under his door. And then I called 15 minutes later. And here's this guy stuck in this suite at the Taj, not meeting anybody, far removed from everything. And suddenly he discovers somebody in India. And in those days, India was considered a bit of a backwater, has heard his album. Hugely excited, said, "Come and have a coffee." So we wandered in and said, "We want to do this interview." He said, "Yeah, yeah." So we talked about the album. And of course, gently, we turned the subject to the Beatles. And he knew he was on the record. And to my surprise, it all came flowing out. How much he hated Paul McCartney, how Paul McCartney had split up the Beatles, how Paul McCartney was okay as a bass player, but he himself was working with a bass player called Willie Weeks. And frankly, I'd rather play guitar with Willie Weeks than George. His wife, Patty, had left him earlier, I think, 2 months before, for Eric Clapton. And this was a great love story because George had written something for Patty, and Eric Clapton had written Layla for a woman he was in love with, and had never revealed who the woman was. And it turned out that the woman was his best friend's wife, Patty Boyd. And then Patty and Eric Clapton ran away, leaving George behind. And Eric then wrote, what is it called? That Wonderful Tonight for her, another great love song. And George was just seething, and he'd recorded on that famous album, which I pretended to like, 33 and Third. He recorded a cover version of the Everly Brothers' Bye Bye Love, changing the lyrics. There goes my baby with you know who, this kind of stuff. And so you just had to pick slightly, and it all came pouring out, the bile about Eric Clapton, the bile about his marriage breaking up. And he was saying this in a manner of somebody talking to a friend. I've often tried to work out why he did this. My guess is he thought that even if these guys carry it, it's some small Indian publication. There was no internet, nothing in those days. Who will read it? Who will care? And he was right, because we went back, we wrote out this story, we sent it to India Today, and they had no interest. They said, "Okay, we'll run one page." So they ran one small page in which all the banal questions you ask as warm up is, what do you think of Indian music? They carried those. And all the real meat of the interview they threw out. They kept the abuse. He said about David Bowie, George was a bit of a fascist. He said about David Bowie, he should first make up his mind what sex he is, then decide what music he wants to play. He said about Pete Townshend, who was also a great lover of India. He said, every time I met the guy, he's been so pissed or stoned out of his mind, I doubt he understands anything. He said about Rod Stewart, he has a brain the size of a marble. So all this was on the record. And of course, India Today carried this, but all the stuff about Paul McCartney, etc., none of it was kept. We hadn't recorded George because we were trying to keep him as casual as possible. And that interview sadly is lost forever.
I'm going to be self-indulgent and just ask you what you think about police and particularly Sting, because you were there with that. The first time, I would imagine that the first rock band in India played at Rang
Bhavan in Bombay. I don't know how many of you know Bombay, but Rang Bhavan is this place, small place near St. Xavier's College, where they used to hold the annual jazz yatras in the 1980s. I won't give you a long self-indulgent version, but basically the police, who I had been a fan of from the time Roxanne was a hit, when they were an unknown band, reached number one, Message in a Bottle, Walking on the Moon. Their I Can't Stand Losing You. They had number one single after number one single. And then they decided that they were going to tour the world and go to places where no rock band had been before. They presented it as an adventure. It was more likely a tax dodge. They wanted to be non-residents for long enough not to have to pay British taxes. In any case, their manager Miles Copeland turned up in Bombay, did not know how to organize this concert, read Bombay Magazine where there was a review of the new Police album, which I had done, called me, spoke to me and said, will you help set it up? And of course I was going to help set it up. So we set it up and the Police played at Rang Bhavan, what I think was really one of their greatest gigs. And because I had set it up, I spent the entire trip hanging around them, hanging around their suite, which was not that much of a big deal in India at that stage because not that many people had heard of them in 1980-81. But I got to talk a lot with Sting and with all the others.
No similar George Harrison type
No,
anecdotes with Sting.
Well, Miles Copeland was a very nice man, but not very interesting. Who else was there? There was that little guitarist,
Andy
Summers, who sort of looked like a jockey. He was a jobbing guitarist who was much older than the others who'd struck it lucky. Even then, the star of the show was Sting. It was very clear he was the star. And Sting had never been to India before. Afterwards, he took up yoga and, according to his interviews, tantric sex. But at that stage, India was still something he didn't really care much about. And I asked him some banal question about India. And he said to me, India needs the British back. That's what it does. And I mean, I'm used enough to English people saying nonsense like this. So I said to him, I said, yeah, but if the English came back and if you had been around during the time of the Raj, the son of a milkman or somebody from the north of England, you'd have been a waiter just like us. You wouldn't have been our ruler. Have you realized that? And he saw the point and he sort of softened after that and he talked. But he was very clearly conscious of being the bright one and much brighter than everybody else. And he hated, even then, Stuart Copeland, who'd actually formed the group. And even then, there was tension. But when they went on stage at Rang Bhavan, there was nothing. Three of them, Miles Copeland, who was the manager, came on stage. And Miles was a very loud, aggressive American. And he said, are you ready? Are you ready for number one? And then he went off stage. And these guys walked on. And there was no fancy lighting, nothing. They were playing to an audience that didn't necessarily know their music. But they just blew everybody away with the sheer brilliance of their playing and the sheer energy that Sting had. He would do a song like, say, Walking on the Moon. And halfway through, he would turn into sing-along with the audience going, oh yeah, oh yo, something like that. And he got the whole audience on fire like I've never seen at any concert after that. I've seen Sting twice after that. He was never anything as good as that time.
The other part of all of this is the underworld. And when I was in Bombay, I remember sort of a slightly traumatic incident. My parents took me out, I think, for an ice cream on Linking Road, and suddenly all the lights were switched off because there was some gang violence outside, and you tend to switch the lights off because you don't want them to sort of look at you and break your windows and things like that. So that part of the underworld is very much present, even for people who are not aware of it. And what surprised me, I shouldn't, I guess, was that you had such access, and that Haji Mastan, who everyone in those days recognized as the Don of Bombay, actually stayed on Sophia College Road next to Pedder Road in a bungalow, and you could go and have an interview with him. What was it like?
Well, that's one strange thing I've noticed. You know, I had heard of Haji Mastan. For those of you who don't know who he was the Don, and he was the basis of the Amitabh Bachchan character in Diwar. He was like this legendary figure who was like a nobody on the docks, like a coolie, became a smuggler, and then became, in his own mind at least, the underworld overlord of Bombay. But the thing I discovered about nearly all of these guys, actually nearly everybody, is that no matter how big they are, how important they are, secretly they're all publicity hounds. They all actually want to be written about. And when we launched Bombay, we put Haji Mastan on the cover. We put him next to Amitabh Bachchan, who played him, Adi Godrej, Parmeshwar Godrej, Viren Shah, all other big guys in Bombay at the time. And he couldn't have been more delighted because in his mind, that was like some kind of recognition. And then after that, I would go over frequently and he would chat and he would hold forth. He would talk about the days when he was smuggling, and he would say that this Diwar and Co. is not really how it was. It was like Godfather 2. Obviously, somebody got a video cassette and translated it for him, and he saw himself as an Al Pacino type figure. But even then, even as Rahul says, even though he was such a big deal, you could tell that things were going wrong. Rahul talks about shootouts there. Wait, was it Waikiki?
On Linking Road, Waikiki.
On Linking Road. And suddenly there were shootouts all over Bombay. There were gang wars. People would be gunned down at say 7 in the evening at a petrol pump. A motorcycle would pass somebody's car. During the day, the motorcyclist would take his gun out, would shoot the driver of the car, would drive off again. And nobody had seen anything like it. And Mastan told me the story. He got very worried. And he called Dawood, who I think you now heard of, and his brother and other rival gangs. And he said, don't do this. You're attracting the wrong kind of attention to the underworld. And he made them put their hands on the Quran, and he made them swear that they would not do these kind of shootouts. And he went to bed a satisfied man, the Don who had brought peace. By the next morning, they were back to shooting each other again. They didn't really give a damn about Mastan. Complete chaos spilled out in Bombay. The police then retaliated by doing what we've come to know as encounters, starting off killing gangsters rather than trying to arrest them, which is always a dangerous trend, because when you allow cops to do that, they pretty much shoot anyone they like and claim they're shooting gangsters. Dawood then fled to Dubai because the cops were determined to eliminate him. And the rest is history, we know now.
And then there's, of course, the political element, because at the same time, Shiv Sena was on the ascendancy. Bal Thackeray was very much a central and powerful figure. And, as a Malayali in Bombay at that time, the risk was particularly close to home. But once again, you had a sort of shall I say, a very casual relationship with him. You were able to joke with him, and he was able to take it. Whenever he said Jai Maharashtra, you would say Jai Gujarat, and there was no issue.
Yeah. He was a strange guy, because he, in his mind, like Haji Mastan, he thought he was king of Bombay and Don and Godfather. And yet there was a side of him. He started out as a cartoonist, a journalist for Free Press Journal. So in his heart, he still saw himself as a cartoonist. He had two great idols, he told me. One was not unexpected. He said, even Hitler was a painter. So I said, well, not quite the same way as you, old boy. And the other idol, which was the really surprising thing, was Walt Disney. I remember going to see him in 1980, and he'd just come back from America. And I said, how was your trip? Oh, he said, we went to Disneyland. I met Donald. I met Mickey. I met everybody. I think I am the Walt Disney of India. And here's this man, the most feared man in many ways in Bombay, who's got to where he has by threatening Gujaratis like me and beating up Malayalis like you. And here he's excited about meeting Donald Duck. So he was a man of many contradictions, I think. But he was also, I suspect, like many of these politicians, or from that kind of background, eager that people didn't forget that he was once a cartoonist, that he read books, that he had views. So if you went over and you had reasonable conversations with him, he was incredibly hospitable. He would talk about anything under the sun. If you wrote anything bad, he'd probably break your leaf, I imagine. But at that stage, it was fine. He would see you to the car. He would say, once you got into your car, Jai Maharashtra. And I would always say, Jai Gujarat. And he would laugh. And finally, we compromised on Jai Mumbai. But he was quite open to all of this. But there was also a slightly bizarre side, which I also, as you read, I've written in the book, that Dom Moraes, who was a well-known writer of that era, did a book for Time Life called Bombay, which was about the city of Bombay. Time Life had a series called Great Cities of Bombay. And a perfectly boring, uninteresting book. And the Shiv Sena had a huge agitation and burned copies of the book. And nobody could understand why. And nobody, even the Shiv Senics who were told to create this mayhem, had no idea. And I asked him one evening, I said to Bal Thackeray, what is wrong with the book? And he said, no, I haven't read it. I don't know. It's just my people. So I left it at that. And suddenly he looked at me and he said, am I short? I didn't know where this was coming from. So I said, no, of course you're not. I said, why this bloody Moraes is called me short? So in the book, there's a reference to Bal Thackeray as being short. He wouldn't let the book be published because of that. So he was a strange guy.
You went to Calcutta after that. And as I said,
did, yes.
in many ways that I was in Calcutta roughly at the same time. And I enjoyed my time in Calcutta because I was studying. But I know that to live and work in Calcutta would have been quite challenging. And let's not talk about exactly the things that you did as a journalist, but you had to deal with the trade unions. You had to find a house which was supposed to take 2 weeks, but took 6 months. What's it like that getting used to, and you at the same time you had a extremely lucrative offer from the Times of India, but you chose instead to go to the ABP group. So what was that like? And if you can maybe just start with the trade union, because I found that hilarious, but then more about what the life in Calcutta was like.
The trade union stories are typical of Calcutta. I used to work for Anand Bazar Patrika. I used to edit a magazine which no longer exists called Sunday. And Anand Bazar had a communist union and there'd been a lot of violence. And then to make some kind of peace, they created something called the Jukto Committee, which used to try and act as a bridge between management and the staff. And one day a delegation of the Jukto Committee came into my office and they said that you've used very obnoxious language with a member of the staff and we will not tolerate this. And journalists use four-letter words all the time, but I was very careful not to use that kind of language with the journalists, and certainly not non-journalists, and certainly not to abuse him. And I said, well, what have I said? They said so and so. The guy he was in fact the peon, I think, in our office. His name was, I think, Shamul, has alleged that you use bad language. So I said, not really. I mean, he did something very wrong. So he said, yeah, he doesn't deny that, but that doesn't justify using bad language. So I said, what did I say? I only said, listen, I won't tolerate this nonsense. And they said, there, you've admitted you said it. So I said, I'm sorry. That you have called him a nonsense. I said, oh, there is no such abuse as nonsense. I said, it is a very, very bad abuse. And took this as confirmation that abused a member of my staff and filed out. Then I went into my office and I said, is nonsense a bad word in Calcutta? They said, yeah, it's one of the worst things you can call a Bengali. So after that, we never use nonsense.
But Calcutta was also where you really started engaging with politicians at sort of the highest level, with prime ministers. And there's a long list of prime ministers that you have engaged with.
Yeah.
Off the lot, you seem to have the best things to say about Rajiv Gandhi, even though there were, ups and downs through that relationship. So let's start with, just the Rajiv Gandhi Zail Singh issue, which was, I still remember that there was a lot of tension in Delhi around this uneasy relationship between the president and the prime minister. And you had the kind of access where you could actually get the story from both sides.
Yeah, I was very fortunate. When I was with Imprint, I met a man called Tirlochan Singh, who was deputy secretary to Zail Singh. And I said, what are all these stories I'm hearing about Zail Singh being unhappy? And I was a Bombay journalist, not even a big deal in Delhi. The magazine was not well heard of. And he said, come and ask Yaniji. So I was completely freaked out. He led me through all these big, glorious corridors of Rashtrapati Bhavan to this room, which was not particularly well decorated or anything, where on an unmade bed, this Sadaji with his turban off was sitting. I think he was wearing a banyan or something like that. And that was the president of India. And I'd never seen him like that. And like somebody had pressed a button, he told his tale of woe about how badly he'd been treated by Rajiv Gandhi and how precedents had been overturned and how conventions were not being respected. So of course, I was completely thrown at this. And I said, poor man. And I went off and I did a cover story in Imprint, which is what I worked for then, about how badly Zail Singh was being treated. And then I became editor of Sunday a bit later. And editor of Sunday was a big deal because Sunday was a big magazine. And they put me on the plane where Rajiv Gandhi was going to Arunachal and Mizoram. And then they put me in his cabin. And it was the first time I'd ever met the Prime Minister of India. And Rajiv Gandhi, you can like him or you can dislike his politics. But what there was no doubt about was that at a human level, he was almost impossible to dislike. He sensed, I think I was quite shaking when I went into that cabin. He sensed that I was nervous. So we were supposed to meet for half an hour. He spent, 10, 15 minutes making idle chitter chatter just to put me at ease. And I enjoyed them. It was very flattering to get attention from the Prime Minister of India. And then I felt that maybe I'm letting this opportunity slip. So I asked about Zelsing. It turned out he'd read the imprint story and he had this whole list of grievances against Zelsing, which he'd never spoken about before, which I can tell them to you, they're quite unimportant now in the larger context of history. So when we landed, I went back to Tarlochan and we got Zelsing's version and we ran, I think as Rahul says, the first story which had Rajiv Gandhi's version and Zelsing's version. Zelsing was delighted. Rajiv's office was really upset because they said you cannot have the Prime Minister of India being contradicted by a man called Zelsing. A man called Zelsing, he was President of India. And I didn't realize it then, but a huge crisis then grew. And Zelsing threatened to dismiss Rajiv Gandhi, who was a Prime Minister with a 2/3 majority. And I think for several days, for a couple of weeks maybe, Rajiv was this close in his own mind to being dismissed, and India was on the edge of constitutional crisis.
And then there was this incident with Satish Sharma that you talk about, and the swimming pools. And the reason I'm bringing this up also is because, once again, incredible access to be able to unpeel the layers of these stories with an actual sitting prime minister who had, I guess, the equanimity to be able to engage with you on this, even though you were on the record and you were going to carry the story.
Yeah, I think one of Rajiv Gandhi's strengths and one of his weaknesses was that when he gave interviews and he engaged on bantering terms. Like, let's say, Narasimha Rao, if you asked a question that was at all awkward, he would dive away or he would duck it. He wouldn't answer it. Now, if you ask a question that's awkward, he'll probably take you out and shoot you. But in those days, it was very, very different because we asked Rajiv Gandhi, Veek Sarkar, and I, who did the interview, about Satish Sharma. I don't know how many of you remember Satish Sharma. He died, I think, a few months ago. He was a former Indian Airlines pilot who'd become this crony of Rajiv Gandhi's, and he had a swimming pool and this luxurious farmhouse, acres and acres of wonderful stuff. And there'd been a scandal because he'd imported marble tiles for his swimming pool. And I asked Rajiv, and Rajiv was ready because he knew I would ask about Satish Sharma, and he said, his father-in-law, who's Dutch, who's rich, gave him the marble tiles. So I said, accept that. But do you know many Indian Airlines pilots who can afford these huge farmhouses in Mehrauli with a big swimming pool? And he was like, crap. And the correct answer would have been, I don't know. Go and ask Indian Airlines pilots. But Rajiv said, of course, yes, they all have them. So it was a completely ridiculous answer. He was doing it just to win the argument. And the moment the story appeared, every Indian Airlines Pilots Association issued statements saying how badly paid they were and how this was nonsense. And then I met Satish Sharma, much to my embarrassment, in Goa that winter. And he saw me and I saw him, and I knew this was not going to go well. And he came up to me and he said, you go and interview Prime Minister of India, and all you can talk about is my bloody swimming pools. I left it at that.
But there was a really nice piece where Rajiv Gandhi actually tells you that it's hard to be prime minister. And I think this was in the context of all of these various things, missteps, and people questioning, you should not have done this. And that's really true. It's easy for us to, and you as a journalist, to sit and question after the decision is taken. But I think he was sort of telling you, if you were the prime minister, maybe you'll make the same mistake.
Actually, he said exactly that. In the last year or so of Rajiv Gandhi, I was very critical. I mean, I thought they mishandled Bofors. There was evidence that people close to him were involved, yet they didn't seem to want the truth. I was critical of nearly everything he did, everything he had promised. In fact, I did a long piece which got me into a lot of trouble with his PMO called Why the Rajiv Revolution Failed. And by then we were just so anti-Rajiv that anything he did, we made fun of. He wanted to start a pop music program on Doordarshan, which was the only television channel. So we ran a snide story about the Prime Minister of India wanting to put George Michael and Wham on television. And my wife Seema, who's sitting in the first row, gave the headline because we knew Rajiv was going to lose the election. And the headline was, "Wake me up before you go," or something like that. So she was now deny all knowledge of it. But so, I mean, he had reason to now deny me access. He did not. We went and saw him, and he knew what I thought about him. And I asked him about things that had gone wrong. And he tried to explain what it was like. He said, when you're outside, you have no idea what government is like. You have no idea of the kind of advice you're given, how many different options you're given. and how much inadequate information you're given, and how you have to make decisions based on inadequate information. You can't reach out. You can't ask guys what the truth is because you're trapped in this prime ministerial bubble. And he said, yes, I made mistakes. But if I made you prime minister tomorrow, you'd make the same mistakes, which I thought was a moment of reflection for him.
And of course, Rajiv Gandhi dies in tragic circumstances. And then, there's P.V. Narasimha Rao, who, I would say you were slightly disparaging of, because you called him a small-time manipulator who
masquerades as a statesman. Yeah. I mean, that's always been my view of Narasimha Rao. I knew him reasonably well. His PS at the time, Ramu Damodaran, his PS his first 3 years, was my closest friend. So I had quite a lot of access to Narasimha Rao, PMO to PM House. I saw how it worked. I met Narasimha Rao several times. And while I don't think anything can take away from his achievements, I mean, he appointed Manmohan Singh finance minister and backed him through thick and thin, even when Arjun Singh and the rest of the Congress was opposing him. And he never gets the credit for reorienting India's foreign policy in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He and Mani Dixit did that. And they gave us a new foreign policy, because foreign policy was the one area where Narasimha was really very good, I thought. While he did all of that, he always struck me as not being a statesman or anything. He was essentially a canny old survivor, at best a likable rogue who'd survived in politics with not that much going for him. He never took a decision if he could help it. We used to say, his people used to brag that he spoke 9 languages. And I used to say, and he can't make up his mind in any of them, because he was this very sort of wishy-washy character, always took the dodgy option, always worked under cover of darkness better than in the clear light of day. Yet people like Chandraswamy, Prime Minister, some of you will know, lives at number 3 Racecourse Road. Number 7 is the office. And there's number 5 when Narasimha Rao's sons used to come and stay. And where Chandraswamy was regularly conducting havans and doing tantric things to keep Narasimha Rao in office. If you wanted to meet Narasimha Rao, you went either through Chandraswamy or you went through another very dodgy character called N.K. Sharma, who was Narasimha Rao's astrologer. So seen up close, I mean, Jayalalitha told me in an interview and on the record that the deal between the Congress and the Anna DMK for the election 96 was negotiated by Narasimha Rao's astrologer. So when you saw him up close, he was much less impressive than the giant we remember from history, the man who liberalized the Indian economy. He was not a member of the Gandhi family, but he held the Congress together. Yeah, all that is true, but that's not the man.
Isn't that a little unfair, given
In
that
what way?
everything that everything that has happened since, you look at all sorts of prime ministerial decisions, and the decision to open up India, liberalize the economy at that point in time, some say it was inevitable, there was no other option, but that is one of those decisions that clearly has had a ripple effect all the way down till now.
No, I think that the foreign policy thing, which he did himself, was more impressive. In the case of the economy, the IMF held a loaded gun to his head. Any prime minister would have had to do the same thing. To his credit, he first looked for I.G. Patel, then found Manmohan. He found a good person and he backed him. But the third decision of Narasimha Rao, which actually affects the India we live in today, which nobody talks about, was he allowed the destruction and the demolition of the Babri Masjid. He could have stopped it. He did not. He went along with it. And hello, you know the India you live in now.
So let's go to that, because and this is, I'm jumping around in the chronology, but you witnessed the birth of the BJP, as it were. You were at that rally when the Vajpayee,
the convention,
when Vajpayee and Advani were there, and you say, of course, I think it's easy with hindsight to clarify your vision, but you could see already that there were moderates and there were more extreme views within that party. And you predicted, I think, that Vajpayee was going to have some challenges, but he was clearly the moderate statesman.
Yeah, there was, to cut to the chase, there was the economic resolution which this new party was passing, and Vajpayee's people had written it, and it said that the BJP believed in Gandhian socialism, and the Rajmata of Gwalior, who was a very important person in the BJP, in the new BJP, and earlier in the Jan Sangh, bitterly opposed this. I could never make out whether her objection was to socialism or to Gandhi. But for whatever reason, they created such a problem that Vajpayee had to back down. And I sense that the strong Qatar RSS elements were not happy with Vajpayee. As far as they were concerned, he was the acceptable face of the BJP. So they were content to have him there, but they still wanted to call the shots.
And you have, over time, you've built, not I think because of your journalistic connections, but because of a personal relationship, a very close relationship with Vajpayee. And I think you mentioned that when he was prime minister, you spent Diwali with him in his house. What was the evolution of Vajpayee from those early days all the way till when he became prime minister, and that you saw him in those unguarded moments?
He was, again, a very difficult man to understand because he never said anything. And when he did say something, there were such long pauses that you thought he wasn't going to answer the question. And you moved on to the next thing. And just as you'd moved on, he began to answer the question. There was a famous story when he was prime minister, when he went to meet, when David Blunkett, who was then the British Home Secretary, came to see him. And Blunkett said something to Vajpayee, and Vajpayee said nothing. And there was this very long pause in the room. And Blunkett, who was, is blind, turned to his aide and said, "Has he left the room?" And just as he said this, Vajpayee began to answer the question. So it was difficult, therefore, to get to know Vajpayee. He was very cautious in what he said. But sometimes there were unguarded moments. He complained about the sun. He complained about Advani. He complained about the kind of pressure that was brought to bear on him. He was, I think, upset that many people thought that Brijesh Mishra was the bright one and Brijesh took all the decisions. Vajpayee, in fact, took many of the decisions. Some people would consider Kargil his finest moment because we beat back the Pakistanis and we won back the bits that we had given. And he told me a story about getting a call late in the night from Clinton, who was then US president. The White House, of course, operates on American time. So wherever you are, you're called at American time. And Clinton said to him, "I'm calling Nawaz Sharif, come to America, we will end this conflict." And Vajpayee had to think about this. And it's a difficult thing to say. And he said, "No, I'm not coming. This is my country. My country is at war. I'm staying here. You want to solve this war? You speak to Nawaz Sharif," which Clinton did, as we know, when Nawaz Sharif called and the war did end. But he was very proud of moments like that for which he felt he wasn't recognized. He had, you could argue that this was an elaborate charade, but I did think, talking to him, that he had no time for the kind of people who demolished the Babri Masjid. He had no time for people who hated Muslims. His foster daughter and husband, who I knew well, had a daughter who Vajpayee doted on. Her best friend was a Muslim. She would come and stay at the house. So they were, in all senses, a completely secular family, very unlike the kind of BJP we see now.
And of course, Advani was his right-hand man through all of this. I think at some point in time, they even lived together as they were growing up.
Yeah, but no impropriety occurred, if that's what you're saying.
No, not at all.
Okay, right. Yeah.
For that, you've got to read the Haji Mastan side.
Or listen to Subramanian Swami. I would go on, yeah.
But then it was Advani, of course, who starts the Rath Yatra, which then ultimately culminates in the Babri Masjid.
Yeah.
And you've got a perspective on Advani as well. I don't think, obviously, you were there, but you've spoken to people who were there when the actual masjid comes down.
Yeah.
And Advani is actually very upset.
Yeah, my source on it, apart from Advani, who's told me many times, written articles saying how it was the saddest day of his life. My source on this is Pramod Mahajan, who was standing next to Advani when it was coming down. Advani kept trying to stop them. And there were various other people on that days. And some, like Murli Manohar Joshi, were, I think, taken by surprise, but not unhappy. Uma Bharti was there, was certainly not unhappy. But Advani was clearly very unhappy. And I don't know, some of you may have worked with Advani. He's the kind of man who cries at the slightest provocation. And Pramod Mahajan led him away because Advani's eyes were now brimming with tears and took him to the guest house where he was staying. And all the way there, according to Pramod, Advani kept crying and saying, "They have destroyed my movement. How will I complain about the Babri Masjid now that there is no Babri Masjid? So it was the saddest day of his life because he thought his movement was dying, not because he cared about the Babri Masjid, but I genuinely believe he had no idea it was going to happen.
And of course, we see the Babri Masjid as symbolic of a big transformation, but you actually relate this in sort of a slightly historical context. And you said that the Congress actually lost the right to the Hindu vote bank. And there's a whole string of events that you recount, including the satanic verses and Kushwant Singh. Do you want to talk a little
Which bit? There's a lot of questions that one.
Just
Which bit do you want to?
Well, why
The satanic
did,
verses
let me
or the
just-
Babri Masjid?
whichever way you want to answer the question.
Okay.
Why did the Congress lose the right to the Hindu vote?
Okay. I've believed, and this is a slightly controversial view because the general view appears to be that Rajiv Gandhi banned the satanic verses in the Shah Banu case, and along came Advani, and suddenly Hindus said, hey, we will hate the Congress and we will vote for the BJP. I don't think it was as simple as that. I think the Hindu vote was created, the vote bank was created in the 1980s, and I think the immediate trigger was the Punjab situation, which was very near Delhi and very near the rest of North India. And now we airbrush this out of history. But there is no doubt that Bhindranwale's target was Hindus. There is no doubt that they would stop buses, separate Hindus and Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs, and kill the Hindus. There was a great sense of anger among the Hindus, a sense that even the Sikhs have turned against us. What are we? Are we impotent? Can we not do anything about it? And Mrs. Gandhi, I think, wrote that anger. Mrs. Gandhi to Hindus, we portray her now as this secular figure, but she has Narendra Brahmachari in her court. She went from Baba to Baba, saint to saint. She wore a Rudraksh mala. She was very clearly Hindu in her symbolism. And I think many Hindus gravitated towards Mrs. Gandhi as being the savior of Hindus when Hinduism was under attack. When she was killed, there's no doubt that the massacres of Sikhs were led by Congress leaders. But equally, let's not deny that many Hindus were as angry and felt that they had to take revenge on her behalf. The Congress's victory in 1984-85 is said to be a sympathy factor. It was, but it was also Hindu anger. Hindus coming together behind the Gandhi family who they thought would protect them. And I don't know if very many people within the Congress saw it. I know Arun Nehru did. And Arun Nehru, I think, carefully worked to build up this Hindu vote bank. And his view was correct, I suppose, in cynical vote terms, which is you're depending on 12% of the population when you could depend on 85. What's wrong with you? And the Babri Masjid decision, I think, is now clear. The decision to open the locks for that dispute. The orders went from Arun Nehru, who was in charge of UP. Wajad Habibullah, who was in the PMO during that period, says Arun Nehru did this without asking Rajiv. I asked Arun Nehru about it. He was very shifty about the details, but he was very clear that he was following, he later joined the BJP, that he was following a Hindu agenda. He had the offices of the Bible Society raided. So the aim then was to cement the Congress position and Rajiv Gandhi's position, therefore, by playing to the Hindu vote, not overtly like is being done now, but subtly enough to indicate to Hindus that the Congress had their back. The whole thing failed because Rajiv Gandhi did not have a single communal bone in his body, did not even believe in God, let alone Hinduism. He was very unlike his mother. And he made many mistakes, I think. The decision on Shah Banu, if you remember, originally when the Shah Banu verdict came, the minister who defended that verdict was Arif Muhammad Khan, who was chief lieutenant to Arun Nehru, who he later joined the BJP. So that crowd was very clear about it. Rajiv was misled. I think it was a mistake to undo the Shah Banu judgment and to take the side of, I thought, Muslims who were on the wrong side of history. When the satanic verses, which Rahul refers to, happened, I was partly involved in that because Penguin Books in those days was half owned by Anand Bazar Patrika, and my publisher, my owner, Vir Sarkar, owned that. And Kushwant Singh was then consulting editor of Penguin Books. Kushwant Singh read the manuscript and said, you cannot publish this book. It's very offensive to Muslims. And Vir Sarkar said, I'm publishing this book. I am not in the business of banning books. If Muslims are offended, they are offended. Salman Rushdie writes literature. He doesn't care about offending this person or not offending that person. We did an interview in Sunday Magazine with Salman in London. And I don't know if Salman was even aware of Kushwan's view or what we can say. And I asked Shabani Basu, who was our correspondent, I said, ask Salman, is he worried about the reaction in India? And she asked Salman, and in an answer, I think that came back to haunt him for the rest of his life, he sneered and he said, it's a funny view of the world to think that a book can cause riots. So he was like in this very smug zone, as was Penguin internationally. This interview appeared. Shahabuddin, who some of you may remember, who was a opposition MP, read the interview, had not read the book. There were extracts in India Today, innocuous extracts. He read those. He called for a ban on the book. I remonstrated with him. I said, you cannot call for a ban on a book you have not read. He said, no, I don't need to smell garbage to know it's garbage. The usual argument that book banners always come up with. His call was echoed by imams. And it's soon, at this stage, nobody had read the book. So the first thing the government of India did was ban the import of the satanic verses. The second thing it did was to tell Penguin not to publish this book. But by then, these guys, Shahabuddin and all these other guys, had found an issue they could go to town on. And everybody started complaining about the satanic verses. None of them knew anything about it. I remember the Shahi Imam of Jamma Masjid, when asked about this, launched an attack on Salman and said, I know this Salman, he's been to Oxford, his father is a minister, who do you think he is? And then it turned out he was talking about Salman Khurshid. He'd never heard of Salman. This is a true story. He'd never heard of Salman Rushdie. But that is the extent to which they whipped up this anger. This anger then spread to Pakistan. In Pakistan, they attacked the British Council office and burnt it. Apparently, Ayatollah Khomeini was watching television and asked, what is this about? And he was told that somebody had written a book that insults the Prophet. And he said, fine, and issued the fatwa. And you know the rest of the story. But I often wonder if Penguin had worked out early enough that, it is a funny old world and books can cause riots, and they'd handled it slightly differently, whether that could have been avoided. As for Rajiv Gandhi, when I remonstrated with him, but he took a simple law and order approach, which is that if there are riots, people will lose their lives, their property will be destroyed, they will never get their lives back. If a book is banned, maybe 4 years, 5 years later, we will revoke the ban. He did not see it as I did, as an absolutist principle that you do not ban books, you encourage literature. And it was then portrayed to Hindus as Rajiv Gandhi once again acceding to requests by extremist Muslims, and frankly he was real, and therefore acting against Muslim and Hindu interests in an effort to appease Muslims. So between Shah Banu and between satanic verses, he pretty much lost any Hindu vote that Arun Nehru had dreamt of accumulating. By then, of course, he'd thrown out Arun Nehru, and he was pretty much flying without a map.
So there's lots more like this, but I do want to get to that one phase in your life where from reporting the news you became the news, and that was
the radio tapes.
The radio
tapes.
Oh,
that was fun. Yeah, okay.
So I had a personal. I was working on a privacy law at that point in time, and we were almost set to get it through when this happened. And they said, look, there's, I think Ratan Tata has filed a right to privacy case before the Supreme Court. There's this snooping happening. Let's put this privacy law on hold because we have to add all of these provisions. And as you know, we still don't have a privacy law. So
we have Pegasus instead.
We have Pegasus instead. But you were the center of the news then. And I think there are many people who have reacted in different ways to it. Barka did what she had. It was you and Barka primarily.
We were like the sidekicks. The main attack was on Ratan Tata. Ratan Tata really had the most to lose, and he filed a case.
He filed the case, but it was against Raja as well because it was in
relation
but
Raja
to
was a crook. Raja was a crook, so nobody had much sympathy for him. But Ratan was a decent man, and they went for him.
Yeah. But how is that? Because look, and also, what is your side of the story? Because what
happy to
knew.
And if I'm happy to talk about it. You contradict me if your side is different from mine. Yeah, the radio tapes came out of a tap placed by the finance ministry, I think the income tax department, on a woman called Neera Radia, who ran India's largest public relations company called Vaishnavi, whose clients included every single Tata company, Mukesh Ambani, and various other international companies. We do not know still who ordered the taps. When they were asked later by the Supreme Court, the finance ministry said, somebody wrote us an anonymous letter saying, who is this woman? How has she built such an empire? And on that basis, they tapped a phone, I think, for 6 months. They found nothing in those 6 months. They tapped it again for another 6 months. I don't think they found anything because nothing actionable or criminal was ever found against her. But because they now had thousands and thousands of phone calls of people talking indiscreetly to her, including people who are very powerful at the moment in politics, but whose tapes were never leaked, they were sitting on a mine that they could use whichever way they wanted. About 5 months, 6 months before the tapes were actually leaked, reports started circulating in the press that she was a dreadful woman and tapes had revealed that she was doing this, that, etc. And that she had asked Vir Sanghvi and Barkhadat to lobby for A. Raja, which was a shock, I think, to both Barkhadat and myself, because I have never met Raja in my life. I have never spoken to him on the phone. I was at that stage writing articles saying what a little crook he was. So why I would have wanted to lobby for him was not clear. When these articles appeared, I went to see Pranab Mukherjee, who'd taken over as finance minister. And Pranab Mukherjee indicated that yes, these taps had happened. He thought the taps were unreasonable and an invasion of privacy. It's no secret that Mr. Mukherjee's predecessor had been Mr. Chidambaram, and that Pranab Mukherjee was not very keen on Chidambaram. So he spent a lot of time suggesting that Chidambaram had ordered these taps and that very different kinds of bureaucrats served in Chidambaram's finance ministry from his finance ministry. And then he dropped a bombshell. He named 2-3 bureaucrats and he said, you know, they've taken the tapes out and they've given them to, and he named an industrialist who I think is a person who they're working for. So I do not know what will happen, which is pretty horrific when the finance minister of India tells you that finance ministry bureaucrats tapped the phone for no reason and have now sold those tapes to the highest bidder, or at least to an industrialist. We forgot about it. The story died down. Then, just as the 2G scandal was breaking and when Raja was in the news, copies of these tapes, there were like 5,000 conversations, copies of 40 conversations, transcripts of 40 conversations, and audio recordings of those conversations were sent in brown paper envelopes to every newspaper office. Many people ignored the conversations. Open Magazine carried them, but carried them without much commentary. Outlook Magazine ran them, and Outlook was then in a bad way and needed, I think, some circulation booster. It's calling them the 2G tapes because 2G was in the news. It was a slightly bizarre thing to do because 2G had been done and dusted by the time these conversations took place. So I listened to those tapes, and there were, I think, 4 conversations that I had had with Meera Radia. And most of the conversations happened when the UPA2 was being formed. Meera Radia was very friendly then with Kanimori and had access to what was happening in the DMK and kept calling journalists because she was a PR person. She knew all of us to find out what was happening. And so there was a normal exchange of information. She told us what the DMK was thinking, and she had her own little interest. She didn't want Maran to get a post. She wanted somebody else. So all of us listened. We forgot about it. These tapes that were released, however, had been edited and, in my view, doctored to make it seem that we were being much franker with her than we'd been. But even then, even if you took those tapes, there was no case for saying that we had ever lobbied for Raja because there was nothing on the tape that suggested that. There was another tape which had to do with an interview with Mukesh Ambani, which sounded very doctored to me, in which I had said, you rehearse him for the interview and I will come and do it. I issued a statement then saying that these tapes had been doctored. I went and met Vinod Bhatta, a very old and close friend of mine. And I said, where did you get the tapes from? I knew we'd got them from. He said, I can't tell you that. I said, you do realize that everybody else has got the tapes. People have just not used them. You were the first person to use them. And he said, yeah, but I had them earlier and my staff were putting pressure on me. So I said, the tapes have been doctored. So he said, yeah, that's okay. That's possible. So what do you mean it's possible? He said, I've written over there. Outlook is not able to vouch for the authenticity of the tapes. So I said, if you're taking the line that these tapes may have been doctored, you're running a story which suggests that we lobbied for Raja or were part of the 2G scam. Did you not at least think that you had a right to get a comment before you printed the thing? So he said, no, now you can write a letter to the editor, we'll carry it. Why don't you write a column saying you're innocent? So I said, that's not the issue. So the scandal raged. None of us realized this then, but it was the first time we saw the IT cell on Twitter. Though newspapers and magazines and television channels were on the whole ignoring these tapes. There was a barrage of tweets, thousands of tweets every day saying to hang us, arrest us, Ratan Tata is rotten Tata, and Barkha and I were collateral damage. M.K. Venu, who's now ironically found editor of The Wire and one of the people behind the Pegasus scandal, took Outlook to court. And Outlook issued an apology saying that they hadn't intended to suggest he was involved in the 2G scandal, etc. So I went to Vinod and I said, there's nothing in the tapes that suggests, even if they're genuine, that I'm involved in the 2G scandal. Will you run what you run for Venu? He said, no, yaar. If I ran for you, everyone will ask for it. So I said, okay, I'll prove to you that the tapes are doctored. In the US and in the UK, there are organizations run by ex-FBI people, ex-Scotland Yard people, and by forensic scientists that do forensic examinations of tapes. Many of them are used in trials in the US. Many are used by the FBI and by Scotland Yard. I got 5 different people to test the tapes. All came back with a report saying that they'd been doctored. In one tape, the one where I was going to interview Mukesh Ambani, my voice had been so distorted, it was no longer recognizable as my voice on the equipment. I went back to Vinod and he said, okay, that's fair. That's scientific. I'll carry it. So he ran it. He ran all the tapes and all the tests saying that they were doctored. But he ran it as a column of my own. He didn't run it as Outlook's view. So I said, now that you have it, Willie, I just want a 2-line thing on the letters page saying you accept that these tapes were doctored. You know, in my big story, how can I do it? So I sued. I went to court. While I was going to court, the CBI told the Supreme Court in open court on 3 different occasions, and it was reported widely to the front page of the Hindu that the tapes had been doctored. I said to Vinod, I don't want to fight this case. You've got this from the CBI. Run a story saying you carried them in good faith, but now that the CBI says they've been doctored, you're content to accept that. You wouldn't do it. So we went to court. They fought us. The Rahejas who own Outlook had lots of money, so they were happy to prolong the case. I was paying for this from my own pocket, so it was an expensive business. I think they thought I would give up. I kept at it, and then finally, because magistrates kept changing as happens in India, a magistrate told Outlook that, look, you're not going to get anywhere with this case. Why don't you settle? So with very bad grace, they gave me what I had originally asked for, a Venu type clarification saying that they had never intended to suggest I was part of the 2G scam, etc. And withdrawing that they regretted having done all this, withdrawing everything that had been said. So that's my part. You tell me.
I'm actually going to let the audience ask questions if they have a different point of view on this.
Happy to hear.
I have one question to ask you at the end.
All right. Okay.
And I was going to take my glasses out and read, I'm just going to say it out of my head. Right at the end of the book, you speak about the change in news that newspapers have started catering to advertisers.
Yeah.
And that when you're the consumer of the news is no longer the reader, that something fundamental breaks in the news business. And this happened, with the Times of India and with HT trying to emulate them. The reason I find that really interesting is because today in the here and now, we get our news from Facebook that very much looks at advertisers as the consumers and we're just sort of products. We're seeing this now, what you saw in the print industry, play through TV, play through, social media. What can we do to reverse this? How can we go back to the time when the readers were actually the people, the consumers of the news that the newspapers cared about, the producers of the news cared about?
Well, look, the model for paying for newspapers has always been that the reader is your consumer, but that the advertiser subsidizes the production of the newspaper, which goes to readers. Samir Jain in the 1980s, and then continued by his brother Vineet through the 1990s, turned that paradigm on its head. And he said that the reader doesn't really matter. It's the advertiser who has the big bucks. It's easier to appeal to a small group of advertisers than to appeal to lakhs and lakhs of readers. So give your paper away for nothing. Do introductory prices, do half pricing, sell it for much, much, much less than it costs to produce, and make up the difference with advertising, because advertisers will see big numbers and they will pay for it. It worked. It worked up to a point. But I was always, as Rahul says, even when I was there to the Hindustan Times, very uneasy with it because it led to what I thought it would, which is people could then pay for editorial, and editorial was not clearly marked as being paid for. And the line between what was paid for and what was genuine began to blur increasingly. What I hadn't realized then was that there was a second problem, which is as media changed, as digital came along, advertising shifted from print media to digital because we now live in a multimedia universe. So if you're running a newspaper and you think advertisers will bail you out, well, think again. Because advertisers have many, many places to go. So where does that take you? You then go to your reader perhaps and say, I will increase the cover price? No, because the guys got so used to paying 1 rupee or 2 rupees for newspapers. The moment you increase your cover price, he'll stop taking you. He will stick with the cheaper newspapers. So that option doesn't work. The other option is to join the digital world. If you look at the New York Times, for instance, it's just declared very high profits because the digital edition of the New York Times is profitable and is successful. It's profitable because it charges people a subscription fee and people are willing to pay. In India, unfortunately, because we have brought up a whole generation on the belief that news is free. And news, actually producing a newspaper is actually a very labor intensive, capital intensive, expensive way of doing things. When you convince them that all of that really didn't matter and they should get it free, they are not going to pay for your website. They're going to object. And some people will, but the vast majority will get their news from Facebook, where it's paid from advertisers, their news from Twitter. They will believe WhatsApp forwards. So that model, the Times of India model, which worked well in the early years of their introduction, it worked well with print, has actually in the long run worked to the disadvantage of newspapers because it made readers unwilling to pay for news, made them believe that news should be free. And because news cannot be free, almost by definition, it's an expensive business. You believe WhatsApp forwards, you believe Facebook, and all of those things.
Thanks so much, Vir. I'm going to hand it over to Ravi, or if anyone has questions, I think there's a mic up front. And if you can take the trouble to come there and ask the question.
You're 1956 born and 1954 born.
Okay, nearly the same age then. Yeah.
I was very happy to read your imprint and Bombay time, right from as a student in college library, and I have been following you through Sunday and India Today. But my question now is, you have seen so many prime ministers, but what is the qualitative difference of Narendra Modi with other prime ministers?
It's very hard to say because when you judge, say, Narasimha Rao, who we've had some discussion about, you judge him for what he did economically. You judge him for what he did in terms of foreign policy. Never before you judge Indira Gandhi from the way she split the Congress, reinvented it, created a new kind of polity with a committed judiciary or whatever. But never before have we been asked to judge a prime minister on the basis of the changes that he or she brought in society. If you look at Mr. Modi's politics, his foreign policy, you may say it's slightly more inept, but is not very different from the foreign policy he inherited. If you look at his economic policies, they're pretty much the policies he inherited. In fact, he's never met a welfare scheme he didn't like, so he's just introduced all of them. The difference that Mr. Modi has made is in society, in the way it's organized, in subliminal and sometimes not so subliminal definitions of nationality as to who constitutes an Indian, as to whether this is a Hindu Rashtra, whether minorities are here as our guests. Those are not things he says himself. In fact, if you were to examine Mr. Modi's statements, there's not a single thing that's offensive or whatever. And yet, he doesn't speak out often enough or soon enough against people in his party who say things like this. So the qualitative difference, if you're asking, between Mr. Modi and his predecessors is that his predecessors, in their own sometimes stumbling and bumbling ways, wanted to take India ahead. Mr. Modi just wants to change it. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Actually, I have been seeing politics since 1970s.
Okay.
Yeah. But not a single prime minister has hesitated to meet press in a group. but I have never seen Narendra Modi speaking one-on-one a group of.
I think he
press
will give interviews to selected
Yeah,
journalists who send the
my
questions
question
to
was
PMO,
wrong.
but he will not do a press conference
Yeah,
which
that's
is
it.
televised where
Yeah,
he's asked
yeah.
questions. Right? His defense, and I imagine, I'm guessing here
Yeah.
he doesn't confide in me, but I'm imagining his defense is he doesn't need the media any longer because technology has advanced to the stage where he can go on Facebook, he can go on WhatsApp, he can use Twitter, he can get his message across now to his voters bypassing the media. I think that would be his defense.
It's not a question, but a remark.
Yeah.
That he got the gift of the gap. He can mesmerize people, but he cannot mesmerize press people. That is my view.
Well, speaking as somebody he's never quite managed to mesmerize, I can't comment on that.
Thank you.
Thank you for this delightful session. First of all, Vir Sanghvi, you came here with no expectations. We were fascinated by what you had to say. My question to you is about the government being so hard on some of the journalists, slapping them with sedition cases and whatnot. Now, why do you think the government behaves like this? Without going into party bias, every party has done this, but maybe we are seeing it a little too much now, or we saw it a little later. Why do you think this happens? And how do you get out of this mess?
I don't think you will get out of what you call this mess as long as this government is in power. I think the use of sedition is very deliberate. They want to redefine the idea of the Indian nation and especially redefine the idea of loyalty to the Indian nation. They are deliberately treating the Indian nation and the government of the day as one. And they're taking the position that if you attack the government of the day, you are effectively a traitor and a seditionary because you're attacking the Indian nation. Now, this is their point of view. They're not ashamed of saying this. If you go on social media, every time you say anything vaguely lefty or secular, you will be told to go to Pakistan. You will be told you're anti-national. If you have a Muslim name, you'll get even greater abuse. That is the India they're creating. And the sedition cases are part of it.
I haven't read the book yet.
Okay.
I'm hoping to buy it and get it signed by you.
All right.
But
Be a
my
pleasure to do
wife and I have read Rude Food.
Okay.
And I have a question from Rude Food,
Okay.
which I'm hoping may be answered in this book.
Okay.
And the question is, what do you think about Indian wine?
Well, I don't think there's a simple yes and no question. I think a lot of Indian wine now is much, much better than it used to be. I think there was a time when Grover wine, which came from not far from here, was the only drinkable Indian wine. Now, Krisma, which comes also from Hampi, is very good wine. Fratelli, which comes from Maharashtra, a lot of that is very good wine. The Chandon sparkling wine, which is made from grapes grown in Maharashtra, is also a good wine. I don't think any country can grow a wine industry overnight. I just think we're moving. We're moving more slowly than we should because governments put all kinds of obstacles in the way of winemakers. But I think we are going in the right direction. Does that answer your question?
Now, I want to ask another question. Sorry, just because you will not get answers to rude food questions because there's surprisingly little food in this book. And that's the question. Why not?
It's 61 bloody chapters. It's a big fat book. If I had included food, I've had to double the length. So we'll do another one on food. Hi.
I'm so glad to be here. First of all, thank you for making this a free event for students like us and fresh graduates. It's really nice.
Ravi, you're thankful for that. I'm
Thank
just
you.
a passenger here.
Thank you. So I wanted to understand with respect to media and control that is placed through ownership, is it free from political will and any other variables that would influence the basic essence of what information should be?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is it varies. I think there are great newspapers generally. Say the Statesman was run by people who only ran newspapers. The Hindu was run by people who only ran newspapers. The Deccan Herald was always committed to truth. I think the great newspapers were always clear about what they wanted to do. The Times of India, because Jains didn't have that many businesses, were clear about what they wanted to do. And in their case, it was to do advertisers. But I think what's happened now is that while people who own other businesses and use newspapers maybe to advance their influence were always vulnerable, there was a sense that if your newspaper kept attacking the government, your other businesses would not give permission, that they would suffer. I think we've gone beyond that now. Now there is a sense, you've seen this, Dainik Bhaskar, you've seen that there is a tendency now to slap enforcement cases, revenue cases on newspaper proprietors. And you can't really complain. You can't really say this is a freedom of speech issue, because the government will then say, we're not saying he should curtail his speech. He can say what he likes, but he's a crook. We're raiding him on an economic offense. Are you saying we shouldn't raid a crook just because he owns a newspaper? So I know and you know and everybody knows what the real agenda is. But the way in which it is now being packaged, you have a situation, at least in Delhi and in North India, where newspapers, even without being asked to do it, will be very careful about what they say about the government. Mr. Advani said about the emergency that when the press was asked to bend, it crawled. Now, I don't necessarily think much of Mr. Advani, but at least in this respect, he was speaking ahead of his time. He predicted what would happen. Hi.
It's a delightful book, delightful read, very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just 50 pages short of it. So two things. One is more of a saying thank you. Long before Twitter and Facebook came, around say early 2000s, 2002, 2003, there used to be this one article which went viral before we knew what viral really was, which was about an article you wrote in Calcutta, about Calcutta and comparing
The Puja article.
yes, about others and how a person having some extra income would buy 2 more newspapers and send their kids to dance and music. And it was, I think I myself have received that back then from at least a dozen people. From
it still does the rounds
it
every
still
puja.
does the rounds. So, and it's a very good read. So thanks
Thank
for
you.
that. I thought if I meet you, I will definitely talk.
Thank you.
about
That means a lot to me. Thank you for saying that.
And the second is a very straight question. You have been around for a long time. You've seen India changing governments. What's your take on 2024?
I don't know is the honest answer. Nobody knows. I was actually one of those naive people who believed that after the Gujarat riots, Mr. Modi would not become Prime Minister. I was completely wrong about that. I did believe that once he became Prime Minister, he would stay for a while. So while many people predicted at the last election that he would lose, I was always sure that he would win. I don't know about the next election because it depends on many things. If you look at the latest India Today Mood of the Nation poll, his popularity is slipping. It's slipping quite badly, but he would still win enough seats to form the government. But if this trend continues, if his popularity keeps slipping, then I think he's in serious trouble. But every time you get near that stage, you talk to voters, and you must have had this experience. You talk to voters, the government this, and they screwed up handling the pandemic, they screwed this up. And then, when it comes to the crunch, they won't vote against the BJP. And you say, why? You said they've done such a bad job. They've divided India. Why are you still voting for them? They say, who can vote for Rahul Gandhi? What is the alternative, etc.? So that is the question the opposition has to answer. Can it give us an alternative to what Mr. Modi has done? I sense that many people are on the brink, that they're ready to jump ship, ready to go over to the other side, but you have to present them with an alternative. Should an alternative emerge, then I think the BJP is in trouble with the next election. If not, more of the same.
Okay, we're going to wind it up. Before I hand it over to Ravi, Vir, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rahul.
This was a delightful book. And I'm
Thank
going
you
to
so
urge
much.
everyone to please read.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It was so interesting. I was just having a wild thought. The curfew starts at 9 p.m. till 5 a.m. We could be here till 5 a.m. and all night better listening to your stories. It was that fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming down and doing this. And Rahul, There was nothing to be anxious about. You did pretty well.
He was brilliant. No, you were
You're
really
brilliant.
brilliant. Thank
Yeah,
you.
naturally, he's also a
Yeah, absolutely.
podcast host these days.
Yeah,
so
I think he feigns this anxiety. He was actually quite confident.
thank you so much. And the books are available outside. Vir's available to sign it. And please do buy it. We need to encourage budding authors.
Thank you. Thank you.